And welcome back to Vancouver Consumer. I'm Sterling Fox, and in just a few moments, lawyer Scott Payne from CBM Lawyers will join us in studio to talk about all sorts of legal matters, including business law, wills and estates, employment issues, and the always controversial residential tenancy file. Nothing like a little free legal advice as we wrap up another year. But first, here are some more of this week's top consumer stories. Canada's National Telecommunications Regulator, the CRTC, says the country's 3 national wireless carriers have agreed to offer a, quote, broad range of lower-cost, data-only plans within 90 days. The CRTC has been negotiating with the company since receiving a lot of criticism about the price of their initial proposals for data-only plans that we've reported on this show. The regulator had ordered Bell, Rogers, and TELUS to come up with data-only plans that it said would fill a void in the market. The CRTC now says the plans will range from as low as $15 a month for 250 megabytes of data to $30 a month for 1 gig. The CRTC says it will monitor the implementation and availability of plans by Bell Mobility, Rogers, and TELUS over the coming months to ensure the companies honor their commitments, and we will continue to watch this story closely. A financial services institution is forecasting an ongoing slowdown in BC's housing market, one day after the Canadian Real Estate Association predicted home sales will continue to dip in our province next year. Central One Credit Union, which provides services to more than 300 credit unions across Canada, says in its housing forecast that BC experienced, quote, a mild provincial housing recession this year. The report released Tuesday points to the federal government's mortgage stress test, higher interest rates, and various provincial policy measures, read taxes, for the downturn, and predicts rising but subdued sales over the next 3 years with little movement in median home prices. Sales in BC's combined metro markets of Vancouver, Abbotsford, Mission, Kelowna, and Victoria are down 40% compared with the end of 2017, led by, of course, Greater Vancouver markets. The report shows annual resale home transactions plunged 17% this year, and median resale prices slipped 2% to around $520,000. The inescapable conclusion: gone are the days of rapid price escalation. A huge relief for many and a game changer for some. Salary comparison website PayScale released its job predictions for 2019 and found that if you want high wages next year, the tech sector is still the way to go. Individuals in skilled areas like AI, cloud computing, digital marketing, and cybersecurity are expected to be in high demand in 2019, said the lead economist at PayScale, and businesses that employ people in these areas will need to remain competitive in their compensation strategies, even if a recession occurs, as many believe is likely, if they don't want to lose ground in this talent market. PayScale also added the on-again, off-again, maybe on-again trade war with China is injecting uncertainty into already jittery markets, which means storm clouds could be on the horizon for 2019. And with wages remaining stagnant for pretty much the last year, if you're looking for a boost next year, you may need to switch your career. Among the highest demand job areas for 2019, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, big data, cybersecurity, virtual augmented reality, digital marketing, and cannabis. As for 2018, PayScale says the hottest job this year was a full-stack software developer, a person responsible for both front-end and back-end development. Well, the U.S. Federal Reserve ignored President Trump's advice and raised U.S. interest rates another quarter point this week, but our Bank of Canada appears to be losing its desire to do the same January 9th, its next opportunity to tweak interest rates here in the Great White North. The Bank of Canada has raised our rate 5 times since the summer of 2017 as our economy has gathered strength. But new factors, including lower gas prices around most of the country, have caused our central bank to hit the brakes. Geez, we even got to enjoy those lower gas prices here for 4 days? Most other parts of Canada still have them too, by the way. Overall, economic data for the fourth quarter is weaker, and bank analysts expect nothing until spring by way of interest rate increases here in Canada. So a modest reprieve for us, hardly a Christmas gift, but we'll take it. And Canadian Blood Services is in need of over 30,000 blood donors this holiday season. CBS says it's predicting a low supply of platelets in the coming weeks. Now, platelets have a 7-day shelf life and help make blood clot, and they're crucial for cancer treatments, also needed for trauma victims, cardiac surgeries, and organ transplants. And as you would expect, during the holiday season, the blood people see a drop in donations. Statutory holidays in December will impact our platelet supply, but blood donors can help ensure they're available by booking and keeping their appointments by January 6, says Canadian Blood Services. Those who are unable to donate blood are asked to encourage others in their networks to give on their behalf. For more information, including how to know if you're even eligible to donate blood, visit the Canadian Blood Services website. It's blood.ca. And welcome back to the program this Saturday afternoon. I'm Sterling Fox. It's a pleasure to welcome Scott Payne to the program. Mr. Payne is a lawyer with CBM Lawyers working out of Langley. Hi, Scott. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you with us today. Now, you're in the Langley office, but CBM has other offices around BC as well, right?
That's correct, mainly in the valleys. Our main office is in Langley, but we also have one in Walnut Grove, one in Maple Ridge, and one in Aldergrove.
Oh, okay. All right. Now, let's. You're a general practitioner, so to speak.
Right.
We get to, which is great because we get to tap you on a whole bunch of different areas.
Go ahead.
But we got to start. We got to start with a Christmas party, Scott. And now I know that in terms of employment law, most of your clients tend to be employers rather than employees.
That's right.
But I want to come at you from the perspective of that person who went to the Christmas party this year, perhaps last night, because it's that season.
It's the time of year.
Let's just say they stepped over the line a little, had a little too much of God knows what, but definitely stepped over the line, and were more than a little rowdy, perhaps a little gropey, et cetera, et cetera. And now they've come in, they're knocking on your door first thing on Monday morning going, geez, can you help me check and see whether I've still got a job?
Absolutely. And I've been in that situation from both the employer and the employee side. So, of course, it's the time of year where, as an employer, you want to give your employees a little time to relax and let loose. But at the same time, you have some substantial liabilities and responsibilities to your employees.
Right.
And certainly from the employee perspective, I have had a few come in wondering whether they still have a job or they might be subject to discipline. And, of course, they get a text or an email from their boss saying, John, can we speak on Monday about an issue?
Right.
So in terms of, let's say, intoxication, one thing to note is that when you see employers disciplining or perhaps even considering terminating employees, it's usually not about the intoxication itself. It's about the behavior. That came, arising from the intoxication.
Stepping over the line bit.
Yes, so perhaps if an employee was belligerent or disrespectful towards other employees, that could certainly be grounds for just cause dismissal, depending on its severity and also other factors such as, has this happened before?
So have you, in your practice, experienced situations where individuals have been fired for cause based on unacceptable behavior while smashed at the Christmas bash?
I haven't had it specifically at the Christmas bash, but I have had one file in particular in which there was, unfortunately, sexual harassment of a few employees at a party.
That happens.
Of course, as the employer, first of all, you want to protect your employees. You actually have a duty to provide a work environment that is safe and free from harassment. And unfortunately, this employer, they did the right thing. They had a written policy making it clear that behavior was completely unacceptable. They conducted an investigation. They talked to witnesses, the victim as well as the alleged wrongdoer, and they determined that these allegations were true, and he was terminated.
Interesting.
Turns out this employee turned around and attempted to file a wrongful dismissal suit, but that was ultimately withdrawn once we went to a settlement conference.
And when you get terminated for conditions like that, for really just being way over the line at Christmas, when you get terminated, do you get severance, or is that called for cause and see ya? You get paid up to the day when all this happened, and you're done.
Right, so you're way ahead of me. That's right. So if it's for just cause, the employer does not actually have to provide any severance whatsoever.
Okay.
But just cause, it's a high bar to reach. You have to show that the employee has somehow effectively severed the relationship or done something that's so fundamentally in contrast to their responsibilities that the relationship with the employer cannot continue.
Gotcha.
All right. So if it's an issue, it's a high bar if it's just for one incident. Usually, what we see is there has to have been, multiple incidents in the past that have been well documented by the employer, perhaps progressive discipline leading to that ultimate decision to let them go.
Right.
Because if the employee disagrees with the decision, says maybe this was just a one-off incident, or it wasn't serious, it was just a party.
I've never done this before in my life.
Or denies the facts altogether.
Right.
They can sue the employer for wrongful dismissal and say, you know what, you've let me go, but now you owe me severance because this was not just cause.
Right.
Right.
Okay, and that could get it pretty expensive pretty quickly, too.
It can. Depending on how much is being sought, this could be a Supreme Court action, which can be quite costly in terms of legal fees. So for the employer, it's important to document the incidents leading to this, as well as documenting what steps you've taken to reach this decision. Because you might have to prove it in court.
Okay.
The logic behind that decision.
At the Christmas party this year, it's going to be a little different, Scott, because for the first time, we have recreational cannabis legal.
True.
It's a legal product. So in terms of employees who would otherwise belly up to the bar are maybe going to want to have a toke instead. But the problem is that you've got secondhand smoke issues, you've got stinky marijuana smell issues, and not everybody in the room is going to be happy with people smoking pot. So what is your advice to those clients who come to you and go, well, because you say employers do have liability when they throw a party for their people.
Oh, absolutely.
If you're going to serve booze or cannabis or whatever, by serving that product, you incur some degree of liability. So what are you saying, first of all, about cannabis and mixing that into the party flow?
Right, and I have had quite a few employers come to me with those questions, and they're saying, effectively, are we going to get smoked out of the office now, or are we going to have to deal with employees coming in and vaping all the time? And of course, at the Christmas party, this will be a particular concern.
Sure.
What you need to know, first of all, is that the same laws that apply to secondhand smoke generally also apply to vaping and smoking marijuana. So if it's an enclosed public space, or even within 6 feet or 6 meters rather of door opening or windows, these are still prohibited spaces for smoking marijuana.
But so Vancouver police say basically wherever you can smoke tobacco, as far as they're concerned, you can smoke cannabis.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, generally speaking, that's true.
So at the party, though, I mean, you've got the problem is it's for a lot of people, it's the secondhand smoke. I mean, you can sit beside somebody getting absolutely cross-eyed, smashed out of their tree on some kind of liquor. And you can sit beside that person until they literally fall off their stool, and nothing's going to happen to you. But if that same person is sitting there smoking pot, the secondhand smoke, as being that close to you, is going to affect you. It's impossible for it not to. That's the big difference. So what are you advising employers? Find a common external area for pot smokers who can certainly partake. We're not abolishing it by any means. It's a legal product, but we don't want you blowing it in other people's faces.
Yes, I mean, that could certainly be one solution, having a designated spot for those smokers to partake. Frankly, if employers want to avoid this issue altogether, they may want to have a policy that, at the Christmas party or generally speaking in the workplace, that they will have a zero tolerance policy for smoking marijuana.
Okay.
Because they want to protect their other employees who you don't want to be intoxicated or impaired, or even just to deal with the annoyance of the secondhand smoke.
Right.
And more generally, when employees are preparing for a Christmas party, it's very important that they have written policies that are communicated to all the employees beforehand as to what their expectations are, not only for marijuana perhaps, but also for alcohol consumption. And it's a common misconception I hear from employers that, we're going to host this in a bar or a restaurant or a hotel, so if anything goes wrong, it's on them.
Right.
Not true. As an employer, you have an obligation to monitor your employees' consumption, whether it be marijuana or alcohol,
right,
and to ensure that the conditions are safe. And you cannot escape that liability just because there is a commercial host who may be partially liable as well.
Which is why, in terms of budgeting for the Christmas party, a lot of companies now include taxi chits or hotel rooms.
Yes.
And one or the other, right?
Yes, or both, if you want to cover your bases, even though that could be expensive, but it's certainly less expensive than a lawsuit. I can tell you that.
No kidding.
And there are a number of other things you can do, practical steps to reduce your liability. One is to make sure that the event has a set location and a set time. And after that time passes, alcohol will be cut off. You also want to limit the number of drinks that are being served. So perhaps a ticket system is much more sensible than an open bar. If you're hosting it in your own office, which we generally don't recommend, but if you do, make sure that you either have a professional who's actually serving the drinks, or that at the very least whoever is serving the drinks has the proper certification, serving it right. Make sure there's food, make sure there's non-alcoholic beverages for those who don't want to partake.
And who's responsible for taking the keys, Scott? On the way out, you can see somebody just stumbling sideways. This person is headed for the parking lot, and that just ain't going to happen. You again, are you responsible to see that person does not get into their vehicle? So must you take that person's keys? Is that on you to take the keys?
It's contextual. So it depends on the scenario. So it's hard to say a blanket yes or no.
Okay.
But if as the employer or the manager or supervisor, you see that someone is about to enter a dangerous situation, such as drinking and driving, I would say, yes, take their keys. Do what you can. Or, if they might be belligerent, because, of course, we're talking about someone who's impaired and may not appreciate the efforts to take their keys, you may want to call the police, call the authorities, let them take care of that issue. And speaking of, a taxi, it's interesting. There's a sort of somewhat infamous case in which the employer actually provide taxi chits to actually paid for the taxi, but because he did not actually ensure the employee actually made it into the taxi, he was liable for the shenanigans that occurred later that night.
Oh, because people didn't take a. Oh, I'm fine. I can drive. I don't need to take a cab.
So it's not enough just shelling out the money for the taxi or the hotel room. You have to actually make sure that your employees are getting home safe, one way or the other.
Interesting stuff. There is a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of those hosting these parties, and it's always with the best of intentions. Let's give the gang a night off. We'll have a few laughs and show a few videos of blunders and people looking weird and ugly Christmas sweaters and all that. But there's a lot more to it than that, and a lot more thought that needs to go into it. Our guest in studio is Scott Payne from Langley and CBM Lawyers. We're going to take a break for the news, and we'll come back. Residential tenancy and strata, among others. And we are back on Vancouver Consumer. I'm Sterling Fox. Scott Payne is with us. Mr. Payne is a lawyer with CBM Lawyers and works out of their Langley office. They have 4 in the Fraser Valley. And Scott, we spend most of our time talking about employment law issues, but you're a general practitioner dealing with other areas besides employment. You deal with estate litigation. If we have a second or two, we'll get to some wills and estates question. But one of the other things you deal with a lot is residential tenancy disputes. Now, I want to take the conversation we had about cannabis at the Christmas party and move it into this half hour and apply it in a completely different context. You're a strata owner.
That's correct.
And you've dropped $750,000 on the apartment of your dreams. This is it. Somebody moves in next door and they're pot smokers, and it seeps through the walls and it stinks, and you're really unhappy. What rights do you have?
Well, that's a good question, and certainly, communal living that's as part of the strata lifestyle can be jarring to some when they're used to having their own home. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, they're living with their neighbors, and you have to get along and deal with the strata council as well. So, with that question in particular, it takes first of all a careful review of the bylaws, the strata bylaws. Now, the standard bylaws include a clause relating to nuisance that prevents the emission of any nuisance, for sound, smell, sights that might irritate your neighbors.
Okay.
So if it's a matter of...
And that's a pretty standard clause in most strata contracts.
It's the standard.
Okay.
So if the strata has filed no new bylaws, it's in there as the standard bylaws under the Strata Property Act. And of course, most people either retain it or strengthen it because there's, it's a good bylaw to have.
Yeah.
So if your neighbors are allowing the emission of the smoke or this odor to the point where it's irritating the neighbors, This means that those owners who are smoking the pot could be fined under the Strata bylaws, first of all. And it can be a fairly hefty fine of a maximum of $200 every 7 days if they refuse to remedy the nuisance.
Okay.
On top of that, if the Strata Council wants to go beyond that and actually prevent the smoking of marijuana in the units, it comes down to, again, how well are your bylaws drafted.
Some buildings are smoke-free, period.
Absolutely.
There's no tobacco, no nothing.
Yes.
It's a smoke-free environment, full stop.
Absolutely. And it comes down to drafting the bylaw as well to include, of course, because we're seeing new forms of consumption. I mean, there's not only traditional smoking for joints, there's also vaping now.
Sure, right.
So what I would recommend for Strata councils is, talk to your lawyer and make sure, get a general review of your bylaws, but considering having a very well-worded, watertight bylaw that prohibits the smoking of marijuana through regular joints or vapes or any similar item, any similar devices within the strata unit or on the common property.
Right, just as you've had in the past, quite recent past, to advise employers on what to do and what not to do with respect to cannabis at the office Christmas party. I'm sure that you're receiving an equal number of calls from your Strata Council clients going, okay, you want to have a look at our bylaws and see if they need a tune-up?
Absolutely. And the common theme here is that just because recreational marijuana is now legal, it doesn't mean that nuisance is legal.
Right.
And in the workplace, it doesn't mean that impairment is legal. So there are ways that proactive measures both stratas and employers can take to make sure they're anticipating the problems and they have procedures to deal with it. And usually the best solution, if it's a strata council, make sure you have strong bylaws that anticipate the problem. If you're an employer, make sure you have written policies that, you might want to prohibit marijuana use altogether.
Sure. Yeah.
And of course, that's subject to human rights concerns because medical marijuana, of course, if there's a physical disability, the employer has a duty to accommodate that. And stratas also have a duty to accommodate that use.
Right.
But it's a matter of, approaching the problem thoughtfully, addressing it in writing, so you're prepared when these problems do arise.
Do people attempt, usually at least, to deal with each other as neighbors to try and resolve this in a friendly fashion? Or do people, if you've dropped $750,000 on an apartment and some bozo next door has decided to become a cannabis nut and all of a sudden your place stinks, you're a little ticked, Scott. You're more than a little ticked. And maybe you don't want to have a friendly chat with the guy. Maybe you're just so mad, I'm going to do something about this. So what do? You go to the Strata Council? Is that where you go first?
Yes, and certainly sometimes it comes down to personality, whether or not you're that type of personality. Would you like to try to deal with your neighbors directly? But generally speaking, I recommend make a complaint in writing to the Strata Council or the Strata manager, so you have a record of it. First of all, you want to create this paper trail, and then the Strata Council then has a duty to respond to the complaint, either make an investigation, and if
they have no choice. If you complain, they are required, just as the city, if you complain about something, the city has to respond with a police officer or a bylaw officer. The Strata Council has to follow up every complaint.
Well, they at least need to take it seriously and see if it's a credible complaint. They may ask for it to be substantiated somehow, but they should be taking it seriously and investigating it. And if they see it as warranted, they may fine the owner of the offending unit.
Okay.
So I would definitely say put it in the hands of Strata Council. That's their job. They're volunteers, but of course they have a job, and they absolutely have the authority to fine or otherwise penalize the owner who's causing a nuisance.
And how many of these cases that fail to be resolved by the Strata Council, how many cases end up on your desk and ultimately in court?
Well, it is an issue, and what we're seeing is, and as I mentioned earlier, Strata councils are composed of volunteers.
Sure.
They're not professionals. These are people with busy jobs who are volunteering their time to help out. And
you've served on a Strata council too, haven't you?
I was the vice president of one in Coquitlam.
Okay, so you know what you're talking about here.
Yeah, and there's a long list of complaints and unhappy people all the time to deal with, and that's just part of the job, and that's okay.
Right.
But we do see is some Strata councils can be somewhat lax, slow to respond, and sometimes they even ignore the owners who are making complaints.
Right.
Now, something people should know is that we have something called the Civil Resolution Tribunal.
This is new
BC.
too, isn't it?
It's fairly new.
Yeah.
And what it is, it's an attempt to make the process of resolving strata disputes much cheaper and faster. So
Right.
the CRT, Civil Resolution Tribunal, most of the work is online. It's done through email. So it's quite accessible to people. And the courts are remanding lawsuits down to the CRT.
Oh,
so we're trying to
really?
make it effectively
Oh,
one-stop
interesting.
shopping
So in
for
some
most
cases,
strata
somebody
disputes.
wants to go to court and raise hell, and the court says, no, we have another method. Why don't you
Yes.
try this first?
Yes. Now, it's not necessarily the venue of first instance. I would say if you're having an issue, try to deal with your strata
Locally.
council. Yes, I mean,
Right.
that's what they're there for. And if you're still having an issues, you can ask for a hearing to make your thoughts known to the strata council more directly. And if they fail to do that, that's where you might want to start thinking about commencing a complaint under the CRT.
Okay.
And they sort of have the broad, flexible discretion to deal with issues and to make orders that are sort of like injunctions. So they can act.
They have the power of a court, essentially?
Well, it's limited, but they don't have what's called the inherent jurisdiction of a court to make whatever the Supreme Court to make whatever order is necessary. But if you look at the CRT Act, there's a provision that allows them to make certain injunction-like orders.
Okay.
So that means that, and we're seeing new case law on this. This is an evolving area of law. But it means they can make flexible solutions and resolutions for strata councils to follow.
Okay.
So it's I would say that definitely talk to your lawyer about possibly assisting with the CRT process.
Okay. Now, what are the typical areas of most contention in that strata environment? I know a lot of people, and you've been on the strata council as a volunteer member yourself, but I've heard a lot of people who live in strata environments complain about cliques within the environment, and the strata council clique has its sort of close coterie of followers, and then there's everybody else. Is that a bone of contention in some areas?
Absolutely. I think one of the major complaints I tend to see is people who are owners who feel they have a valid grievance. They've attempted to bring this to the attention of Strata Council, and Strata Council has, for whatever reason, ignored them or haven't made the proper efforts to investigate the issue. And so it's best to maintain a positive relationship with the Strata Council and go through them first of all. But under the Strata Property Act, there are avenues you can follow if the Strata Council is not doing its job. Under Section 164, if their Strata Council or the Strata Corporation has taken actions that are unfair to a particular owner, they can pursue a claim in Supreme Court.
Oh, is that right?
And there's a similar equivalent in the CRT.
So if you disagree with a ruling by your strata council, which may be against you, it's not the end of the line. You just have to suck it up and deal with it. You can actually take them to court.
That's true. You could.
But then things get pretty expensive pretty fast, don't they?
Well, the good news is, even though if you look at the Strata Property Act, it says that the avenue you have to follow for that remedy for unfair actions is through the Supreme Court. The CRT is making very similar orders and following the same case law that is produced out of the Supreme Court.
Okay.
So from my view of the case law, it looks as though the CRT is making itself available effectively for those sorts of remedies.
So I think
it's a much cheaper process.
Well, I was just going to say, it's really good to have you here because here we are at the end of a year and people sort of, making their lists, checking them twice, and all of that sort of thing. But in terms of organizing the resolutions for next year, this is when we start doing that. And in some cases, people are going, I'm tired of this. I'm not going to put up with this. Come January, I'm going to go to the Strata Council and I'm going to get satisfaction, whether it's parking or whatever the issue may be. And the concern, of course, is that where do I go if they, kick sand in my face or whatever? Well, now we have this CRT, is it Civilian Resolution Trial?
Civil Resolution Tribunal.
Tribunal, right. Mm-hmm. Civil Resolution Tribunal. I'm assuming composed of lawyers.
Yes, I mean they have arbitrators who effectively make decisions. But
right.
And one of the advantages of this is it's designed for people who don't have lawyers, so it's quite accessible. And as I mentioned before, it's mainly done online.
Right.
So you can avoid the usual process of having to show up in Supreme Court months or perhaps even years after filing the action, and perhaps being bumped over to the next year.
Right.
It's made for quick, cheap resolutions of these matters.
So they can't delay you to death, kind of thing.
Well, I wouldn't guarantee that, but certainly much better than in Supreme Court.
Interesting stuff. So what other areas of conflict are there based on your experience on both sides of the desk in the strata dispute zone? What are the most frequent beefs?
Well, the other one we tend to see is our complaints over pets. And of course, this dovetails with the nuisance issue.
Right.
So often, you might have a dog who tends to be, you wake up and start yipping from midnight to 2 a.m.
Right.
And
that's definitely a nuisance.
That is a nuisance. So the ones I see, they tend to be nuisance claims. It's about I have this neighbor, and for whatever reason they're refusing to remedy their issue, and maybe the Strata Council is not doing enough to investigate the issue on its own.
And what about people trying to sneak pets into buildings that don't allow them in the first place? I can't imagine that lasting very long.
I guess it depends on the pet. I mean, I've been involved in one case in which I think one of the Strata owners had a weasel. So you have some unconventional, less obvious pets to come in. Yeah, so it's hard to say, but it definitely is an issue we're seeing. I think pets, marijuana, and complaints about Strata Council itself tend to be the top three that I see coming in.
Okay, and again with the Civilian Resolution Tribunal, now there's a third road for people to take that isn't going to cost them an arm and a leg and will likely, not always, but likely give them more immediate return on their queries, the complaints, whatever, than the typical sort of court route, which can be long and expensive.
Absolutely.
Interesting stuff. So as far as the other aspect of strata living that I wanted to get to, don't have a lot of time left, Scott, but here in Vancouver, the rules are different perhaps than in Langley with respect to Airbnb activities taking place in stratas. We're really trying to ferret that out in Vancouver, and there's all sorts of investigations and rat on your neighbors and all sorts of stuff going on. And of course, lots and lots of taxes. But if you're in a strata that you've decided that I'm going to be away a lot, so why don't I just make a few extra bucks and let this place pay for itself and put it on Airbnb? Well, the strata isn't necessarily keen on it, so who's going to win that fight?
Right, and again, it comes down to having well-written bylaws. I mean, so certainly we have owners who, as you say, who may be out a lot and want to turn a profit with their unit, and fair enough.
It's their unit; they paid a lot for it.
For your neighbors, we have. I think the viewpoint is often that they want owners who have a long-term investment in the property,
right,
and who care about it being maintained, and who are interested in the general well-being of the strata property.
And another story in the Vancouver Sun this morning. Party house that, it's an Airbnb thing, and the rest of the tenants, the rest of the residents are supremely ticked off.
Yes. I mean, when we hear of, egregious amounts of damage, it tends to be because of short-term rentals or Airbnb. Now, under the standard bylaws, of strata corporations, units are not allowed to be used for illegal purposes. So if the municipality you're in
says,
has not allowed for Airbnb or VRBO or their similar uses, then the use is automatically illegal. But if you are not in such a municipality, but as a strata council you want to avoid Airbnb and all those issues,
then you got to create your laws.
You need a good bylaw,
right,
clearly, and you need to make sure it's worded very carefully so that it prohibits Airbnb, VRBO, any similar short-term use or accommodation. And a nice trick I like to add to this one is because it's difficult to enforce this. Right? Mm-hmm. How can you know how a particular owner or occupant is a tenant or an owner or Airbnb? Is to prohibit marketing or listing for Airbnb online. Because this means
that's all the proof you need.
It's much easier to enforce as a strata council.
Right. Fresh out of time, I thank you for yours on a busy Christmas shopping weekend, Scott Payne. Mr. Payne can be found at cbmlawyers.com. That's the website. He works out of the Langley office. They have 4 around Fraser Valley particularly, and all is contacted, the email, phone number, all of that stuff on the website, cbmlawyers.com. Merry Christmas, Scott Payne.
Merry Christmas.
Nice to meet you, and perhaps we should do this again sometime.
That was fun. Thanks very much.
We'll tell you, open up the phone lines next time.
All right.
And once again, our thanks to Scott Payne from CBM Lawyers for a very informative visit. We sure covered a lot of legal ground. Next week, we wrap up 2018 with advice for family business people and how to make that enterprise thrive with advice from Emily Griffiths-Hamilton. And lawyer Kyla Lee will return with lots more on our newly reformed impaired driving laws. Lots of changes to understand. And of course, we'll open up our phone lines for your questions. Time now for Duly Noted. And this time around, our producer, Ben Dooley, looks at the sugar high myth.
Thanks, Sterling. When kids start bouncing off the walls, sugar often gets the blame. Some parents will likely find it difficult to believe, but research suggests there's no such thing as a sugar high in children. Here's Dr. Mike Waldrich, a professor at the University of Oklahoma.
We couldn't demonstrate any effect that the sugar was changing the children's behavior.
Waldrich and his team debunked the myth in the 1990s. For some reason, the myth seems to continue to exist among parents. Here's Leslie Langill, a registered dietitian at the Center for Family Nutrition in Calgary.
Thought it to be true myself, but it's because I can see how excited my kids get when they do have, sweets.
However, this information shouldn't give kids permission to overindulge. Too much sugar can cause concerns for obesity and teeth decay. Kids under the age of 2 should avoid all added sugar, according to Langill. For kids older than 2, added sugar should represent about 10% of caloric intake, which is roughly 6 teaspoons. I'm Ben Dooley, and that's Duly Noted.
Thanks, Ben. We're a bit early with this story, but it's a good reminder if you're making plans for New Year's Eve. TransLink will be helping revelers across Metro Vancouver enjoy their New Year's celebrations, all the while starting 2019 safely. There'll be free public transits across the entire region between 5 o'clock New Year's Eve right through until 5 a.m. on January 1st. This means free rides on all buses, all 3 SkyTrain lines, and the C-Bus. And with over 100,000 of us expected to head downtown to the New Year's Eve fireworks show, there will be a big increase in service with more frequency and later operating hours. SkyTrain will be running 1 hour later, as will C-Bus. And the SkyTrain Dance Party New Year's Eve version starts at 7:30 on New Year's Eve at Waterfront Station. That is our show for this week, produced by Ben Dooley with Tim French helping out. We appreciate the feedback, and we also want to take a second to wish you and yours a very Merry Christmas from all of us on this program. We'll see you next Saturday at 2 for another edition of Vancouver Consumer.